Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most intense and consequential moments in U.S. history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war as President John F. Kennedy faced the challenge of a lifetime. His decisions during those tense 13 days have become the gold standard for leadership under pressure. To unpack the invaluable lessons from this pivotal time in U.S. history, I am joined by two guests. Dr. Kathy Pearson, a renowned strategist and systems thinking expert who has shaped leaders at organizations and has taught for many years at the Wharton School of Business. Joining her is Dr. Gregg Pearson, an American history expert whose insights bring history to life. Together, we'll uncover how Kennedy's approach to decision-making during a pivotal moment in history not only influenced the outcome of the crisis, but also provides enduring lessons for today's leaders. This episode is packed with actionable insights, and these timeless leadership principles are sure to inspire and elevate your ability to lead effectively in any situation. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. In this episode, I love to unpack some of the leadership lessons in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This episode is going to unpack one of the most pivotal moments in American history, exploring how Kennedy's decision-making shaped the outcome and what today's leaders can learn from his approach. So to help us, I have a history expert, a leadership expert. I'm going to start with the history expert, Gregg, to give us the stage, setting the stage for this historic event in October 1962.
Okay. Thank you once again for having me here again today, Charles. It's our pleasure. As Kathy knows, as a historian, you never run out of things to talk about and tell stories about. So great to be here. John F. Kennedy had several severe crises, international crises that he was faced at very early on in his tenure. And this was at the height of the Cold War. This is when the United States thought that there was this huge missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time, and he basically wanted to challenge Kennedy on several different things. So the first issue that Kennedy ran into was, at this point in time, the revolution in Cuba had happened. So Cuba was now run by Fidel Castro. They were a client state of the Soviet Union. And, Khrushchev wanted to go ahead and challenge him in Cuba. So in order to kind of get the jump on Castro, Kennedy initiated the Bay of Pigs invasion. And this turned out to be an unmitigated, horrible disaster. And part of the reason it was such a great calamity at the time was that most of the information and the intelligence was coming from just the Central Intelligence Agency. And the principal sources of intelligence that the CIA was getting were from Cuban exiles. Bigwigs in Cuba that had been ousted by the Castro regime. So they were feeding all sorts of intelligence to the CIA. Kennedy just kind of bought the CIA's information that once again came from sources that had a vested interest in returning to Cuba. And the Bay of Pigs turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. After that, the Soviet Union went ahead, and the Soviet Union, in conjunction with the East German government, went ahead and constructed the Berlin Wall. And this was a great surprise to Kennedy and the U.S. administration. They really didn't see it coming. And rather than go ahead and, Berlin at the time was, deep inside East Germany, the Soviet-controlled area of Europe. So, once again, took no action, very little action. And these are kind of the precursors for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Essentially, the U.S. Kennedy administration had done very poorly early on in two major international crises, and this kind of set the stage for what would happen with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Thank you for providing that context, because one of Kennedy's early mistakes as president was the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Berlin Wall. He didn't act decisively or soon enough. He relied on a narrow circle of advisors and fell victim to groupthink. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he approached things differently. Kathy, talk to me more about confirmation bias, often, blinds leaders to these alternative solutions, and how can leaders today actively seek out opposing viewpoints to avoid this trap?
Yeah. So, once again, a field of decision sciences, we study different cognitive biases, and one that's been studied extensively is the confirmation bias, which most people are familiar with the confirmation bias. It's basically we tend to look for data that supports what we believe, but it's also that we refute data that doesn't support what we believe. And often this is done subconsciously. So, how I see this playing out in organizations, right? So it's easy to say, "Oh, I like that data. I don't like that data," but it's more than that. So I see it, for example, when a leader is putting together a leadership team or a project team. He or she, like if I'm a leader, I naturally want the best people that are really smart and really insightful, and coincidentally, they tend to be just like me, right? Because of course and in fact, if Gregg, not that this ever happens, but every now and again it does, if Gregg has a different point of view, I may even in my brain frame it as, oh my gosh, if he's on our team, it's going to be just disruptive because he's going to disagree with everything that goes on, right? We can almost convince ourselves that, hey, I don't want Gregg on here because it was going to be completely disruptive. And so I think recognition, self-awareness is number one. And if I'm a leader, to understand I have this tendency just because I'm a human. So I think that's really important. And then I think it really is, can I seek out those that I am pretty darn sure, not just diversity of thought, but they have opposing views. It's what Lincoln did, which we talked about last session, and I think that it's being self-aware and saying, "I'm actually gonna look for people that I'm pretty darn sure they have a different worldview than I." Not just diversity of thought, but I know that they oppose it because they're gonna be crucial to our team.
Well, and partially because he failed in the decision of the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy was hesitant to make any moves to stop Russia from dividing Berlin. He waited for that perfect information. With you and I, Kathy, have talked about before, you don't get perfect, complete information. You always have to operate under uncertainty with incomplete information. How can leaders do that better these days or feel more comfortable in doing it, realizing that perfect information just doesn't exist?
This is the number one challenge. I do think, and I've been encouraging Charles, you know this, or I know we're so tired of talking about COVID, we could just, throw up. But truly, if you think about a time in history, at least from a corporate or corporate, individually, in all aspects of our lives, personally, a time of great uncertainty. That was it. I mean, it's a petri dish of experiment on what do you do when you don't have information. And I can't tell you how many leaders during those first few months of COVID were like, hey, I'm having to make decisions by the seat of my pants. I have no data. I don't
Right.
have historical data. We should take some lessons from that. And I've even asked, people will even tell me, I've heard people say things like, I felt like there was a lot of grace, or it was okay to say, I don't know, because nobody knew. It was a great, great equalizer. Somebody recently said to me, I felt like it was the great equalizer. And so I think that's part of what we sort of need to use as an example. We know we have operated when we don't have all the information, and I don't think it's gonna become any less uncertain in years to come. So, that's my first advice.
I'm in agreement with you. Leaders need to make decisions without complete information, so it's critical that they ensure that they obtain objective and relevant information when possible and test decisions with contrary views. Kennedy did this so masterfully during this crisis. Greg, give us kind of the backdrop now. Cuban Missile Crisis happens. Kennedy has a different approach altogether to this, but kind of give us this historical context as we start talking about this event.
So very secretively, not only to go ahead and protect their satellite, if you will, in the Western Hemisphere, but also to prop up Castro's regime, the Soviets in September of '62 started to shuttle over missiles into Cuba, and they started setting up these missile sites. Well, at the time, you talk about having as near to perfect information as you can in this world. We had the U-2 spy plane, and we would send U-2 flights over there. And very quickly, the U-2 flights came up with the fact that, hey, there are Soviet missiles. And, we had experts at the time that could tell you the type of missiles they were and this type of thing. We knew they were nuclear missiles. And this obviously was something Kennedy could not stand for. If the information got out to the American public, it would create a huge amount of panic. And so Kennedy went ahead and had these U-2, he had great information at this point in time, something he did not have during the Bay of Pigs when he was relying upon wealthy Cubans, that had a vested interest in getting back their sugar plantations in Cuba. he had very reliable, incontrovertible information. So very early on in the crisis, he set up XCOM, with short. We love acronyms in the military, and the government is not short on them either. XCOM, which essentially stands for Executive Committee. And you had, Donald Rumsfeld on it. You had Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time. And basically, Robert Kennedy became his principal advisor during this. But then you also had the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it was chaired by Curtis LeMay, who was Air Force general. During World War II, he was in charge of principally a lot of the bombing missions against Japan and Asia. So then you had the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And generally speaking, with Rumsfeld, certainly with Robert Kennedy themselves, they had a little bit more moderate view on the solution to this crisis. And the Joint Chiefs were recommending all sorts of military actions. So basically, by having very good objective information, incontrovertible information, Kennedy could go ahead and confront this. Came up with a variety of different options, blockade, intercept, supply ships, invade Cuba, alert our nuclear arsenal worldwide, conduct some type of limited incursion into Soviet or Soviet-controlled territory. Those were some of the options that were on the board. And in any organization, a lot of times, you at least in the military organizations, you kind of want to have a stepped approach. You only in rare circumstances do you go in with your full-fledged approach when something maybe lesser can go ahead and accomplish the mission. But the other thing that Kennedy did in all this too is that once he had a plan on how he wanted to go ahead and address the situation in Cuba, and once he had the incontrovertible information, pretty much had a plan on how he wanted to go ahead and address the information. He basically made the decisions, and he would come out in his meetings with the XCOM and say, well, this is what I think we should do. And then you would kind of use the military heads as devil's advocates, if you will. And so kind of set up a little bit of a debate, a controversy amongst his committee to kind of come up with a better solution. But once he did all this and kind of had a plan on how he wanted to execute it, he brought forth a nationwide address. And for any of the perhaps younger viewers of this podcast, you can probably go find this on YouTube. Made an address. I was only 2 years old at the time. Made an address from the Oval Office with some very, I guess at the time they were the best graphics that they had available, but they're pretty hard to read maps of where these U-2 surveillance photographs, and the fact that you would go ahead and take a ultra top secret compartmentalized photograph and essentially display it publicly to the entire American public. That was all designed to go ahead and build trust and support for the actions that we're going to be taking subsequent to the announcement to the nation as a whole. Kind of build support for his decision. And so that was, I think, probably the third leg. Good information, a wealth of options. The good information allowed him to come up with a wealth of options. He kind of used the process of decision making, had a devil's advocate in there built in with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Basically it was a three-legged stool. Good information allowed him to come up with a wide range of options. And then once again, when you're just about ready to implement those options, and obviously we set up a blockade, as everyone knows, kind of spoiler alert, set up a blockade and it worked. And then third thing, once you had all that, then you wanted to go ahead and get the American public behind you and the world behind you too at this point in time, not just the United States. So those are the three things that Kennedy did. And it was just such a methodical approach to resolving this crisis. And we'll talk a little bit more about how it actually got resolved. It's such a difference from Bay of Pigs, Berlin Wall, Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think it shows his maturation as a leader in a couple of different ways. Number one, getting better information as time went on. And then number two, kind of honing his own personal leadership style and how to go ahead and make decisions.
Love it. Great insights there. Because like you said, another lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis is the importance of obtaining and leveraging high quality information. You mentioned the U-2 reconnaissance flights provided that clear photographic evidence. It was used then to gain support of the American public, which gave Kennedy the clarity and the kind of the motive to act. In today's world, Kathy, how can leaders balance that objective versus subjective information in order to really prioritize reliable data while still leaving room for intuition?
Just for your viewers, I'm a statistician by training, so I'm always going to err on the side. If you have good relevant data, use good relevant data,
Kathy
right?
loves her numbers.
I love my numbers, right? So I like numbers. But just as we've said, the chances that you're going to have all the relevant data that you want is just small. So you do have to bring in intuition, which is basically a subconscious database that we build over time on our experiences. I think it's, and by the way, I've heard a lot of people say, not to go back to COVID, but in those first few months of COVID, leaders had to fall back and use more intuition because of lack of data. So, but I think it's important that there's that balance. But I think what's really an important balance, because I mean, if intuition is so great, why don't we just get a bunch of old people to make the decisions all the time? Well, because we as humans are biased, and we individually are biased, and that's why we need to really balance intuition with critical thinking. So I think it's like a three-legged stool, to steal a phrase that Gregg just used. It's analytics. Boy, if you got analytics, let's leverage that. Intuition and critical thinking. So I think it's a balance of all three, to be honest, particularly when we talk about complex decisions. In decision sciences, we study a lot about intuition and, of course, critical thinking.
When Kennedy's really overarching purpose was pretty clear. I mean, he wanted to prevent a nuclear war while maintaining national security and global stability. And that was a tough task or ask to make. And this purpose really then guided every decision, from rejecting immediate airstrikes to Cuba to choosing a naval blockade as a middle ground solution. Kathy, why is having a clearly articulated purpose so essential for leaders in uncertain environments?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to let Gregg address this as well, only because when I talk to civilian audiences, which is most of my audiences, I talk about what the military talks about, commander's intent, right? How important in the military commander's intent is. And it's, what's the overall intent of a battle, for example? And there's a lot of reasons why that's important. But from my standpoint, it's because it's very difficult to be adaptable in the moment as you're executing on a decision, for example, if you don't know what the overall intent is. Because it is going to change. The environment's going to change. You're going to have unanticipated events. And so how do you know how to adapt? Again, my third time to go back to COVID, I saw this tangibly time and again. Senior leaders who were really, really good at articulating, listen, our first and foremost job is to keep our employees safe, or our first and foremost job is to get to our client or customer. How you do that, you go do it. And if it doesn't work, try something else. We saw that. And you saw that being highly correlated with successful outcomes. So I would say it's really important not only to get everybody rallying around in motivation and tell me why I'm important, but it's very important for adaptability. But Gregg, I know you have a perspective because you did serve in the military, and commander's intent way better than I.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's we kind of get back to, we talked about it in the last episode on Lincoln, the idea of purpose. In the military, it would be called commander's intent. I mean, you get an operations order, it could be, 10 pages long, but I mean, how much of that are you going to remember other than, when am I getting in my ammunition and when am I getting fed? Oh, what are we supposed to be doing? Okay, taking that hill. Oh, okay, I got that. That's the intent. I mean, in our book, I like to use a anecdote from D-Day, the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, is that they get up to the top of the cliffs there, Pointe du Hoc, and these 4 guns that we're supposed to be finding aren't here, but we're supposed to find these guns. We know they went somewhere. So they ended up finding them. They weren't where they were supposed to be, but they were someplace else, moved further inland, and they ended up finding them and destroying them and accomplishing a major D-Day objective. So, I mean, and the guys that executed it were not the, senior leaders in the organization. It was kind of your mid-level managers, if you will, your sergeants that kind of went ahead and got it done. So, in a business sense, is that, if your objective is to roll out a new product, a new service, everyone needs to understand that that's the intent of the organization, is to roll this out by this and such a date, regardless of if it's the most senior person, a finance person, or if it's, your most junior person in the shipping department on third shift. They need to understand the intent. And then if they understand the intent, they'll figure out how to get it done in most cases. If you got to get employees, they'll figure out how to get it done in most cases. And in a lot of times too, when you're dealing with good employees, high potential people, they want to put their own brushstrokes on it, if you will. All right. They want to maybe have some input into how to go ahead and get something accomplished. And if you let them know this is what needs to be done, you all figure it out. You know what? 9 times out of 10, they'll go ahead and do it and get it done. Might not be the way you would have gotten it done, And this reminds me of something from the David Petraeus said this about the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan when we were trying to hand off more control to the Iraqis and to the Afghan National Army. One of Petraeus's, guiding principles was sometimes the locals doing things well is a lot better than us doing them great. And, once again, they understand the intent, they'll get it done. Might not be the way you would have gotten it done, but it gets done, it accomplishes the objective and fulfills your intent.
Love that insight because you're right. The Army invented this concept, and it's a crisp, plain talk statement that appears at the top of every order, specifying the plan's goal, the desired end state of the operation, so the commanders can attend. Never specifies so much detail that it risks being rendered obsolete by unpredictable events because no plan survives contact with the enemy. But it allows you to have that intent and not lose the ability to execute on the original plan regardless of what may happen on the battlefield or in the corporate environment. Herb Keller at Southwest, his commander's intent, which he was famous for, is that we are the low-cost airline that kind of directed all of the employees to think, okay, they may not specify everything I do, but I want to maintain that intent of being the low-cost airline. So there was one book that stated one of his employees came to him and said, why don't we offer better food on our flights or some food on our flights? And he's like, okay, what's the intent here? Is that going to help us become the low cost airline or not? And that was kind of that guiding principle that led that airline for so many decades in making sure that they stayed true to his vision.
Another example, just sort of this having to be adaptable. Again, I was just in the last 6 months talking to a manufacturing executive, and he said, we're talking about, again, COVID, and this is in the United States. So all of their manufacturing facilities, they were essential workers, basically. They all had to go into work. And he said, I had to keep emphasizing to my plant managers, right now, your overall goal, your commander's intent is to keep those employees safe. It's not about throughput. It's not about cost cutting. It's about keeping the employees safe. And what was interesting, what struck me about this was he had plants in lots of different states. And I don't know if you remember, but every state had its own little guidelines that were going on. It wasn't like there was a federal. So he had to render control of how it was going to be implemented to the folks on the ground. Because it wasn't like you could have a blanket and you better do X, Y, and Z. They had to, just by definition, have a different plan and have to be able to lead from the middle, basically. And it was a real good example, again, of commander's intent.
There's so many popular accounts that really describe the Cuban Missile Crisis as the model for decision-making in a strategic emergency that any leader can really learn from. And another key aspect of it is how Kennedy learned from failure. Gregg, walk us through kind of, now getting into the Cuban Missile Crisis and kind of how he learned from his experiences with the Bay of Pigs and how that shaped his approach and decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know if you agree with me, but the movie 13 Days offers kind of a good snippet or insight into how decisions were made during this crisis and how different they were in the previous ones.
I think the first thing is that what differentiated the Cuban Missile Crisis from Bay of Pigs and Berlin in between is that progressively Kennedy was able to get more reliable and better information. That's the first thing. The second thing is that he did seek, rather than just taking the CIA's analysis as he did in the Bay of Pigs, he set up a structure with certain key individuals and with XCOM and with the Joint Chiefs and came up with contrary views. I mean, the Joint Chiefs wanted something more military, whether it was an invasion, airstrikes. Let's go. Soviets hit us. Let's go. Let's drop something in their backyard. So he sought contrary points of view. The quality of the information obviously was a lot better and more reliable this time around. And, just given the time constraints, when a decision, you identify a problem and then you have to fairly quickly come up with a course of action to resolve the conflict. You did not have the luxury of collecting endless reams of data. And in this case, I don't think you needed to collect endless reams of data. We knew that there were nuclear missiles in Cuba. Kennedy's policy can't stand for this. This is a bridge too far, and came up with some different options, a wide range of options available to him, and try to, choose some middle ground there that he hoped would go ahead and resolve the crisis. And in effect, he did. Now, what's kind of buried in this, and I mean, this is, oftentimes viewed as a great win for the United States and, a great defeat for the Soviet Union. essentially at the end, it was a compromise. The Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, and we removed some missiles from Turkey that were able to go ahead and reach into the Soviet Union. So, it was kind of a compromise. But quite frankly, the missiles we removed from that we removed from Turkey were old, outdated missiles anyway that we were looking forward to replacing. So, yeah, we just kind of threw that in there to kind of allow Khrushchev to save a little face, which he could, say, look what I did. I got the missiles out of Turkey. Yeah, we took our missiles out of Cuba, but I got missiles out of Turkey too. So, allowed him to save some face. So it was a good, safe off ramp, and I think all the way around, from the collecting the information, the contrary points of view, the decision making on what, how much do you want to escalate this conflict? Is there a way to de-escalate it? He did. So crisis averted.
When you're right, and that's a good distinction to make, that the final outcome was clearly a compromise on both sides, relented in some of their demands in hopefully in averting a nuclear war. And Kathy, failure is often the best teacher. How can leaders use their past mistakes to really refine their decision-making processes?
First of all, I think it's really good to distinguish between a failure and with good decision making process, and a failure because you poor decision making process, right? Because if you're making a decision under uncertainty, you can't guarantee a good outcome no matter what. And I think, again, stealing from the military, the military talks a lot about these after action reviews that are done after every, again, Greg can talk about this more, but after every sort of event, and whether the outcome's good or bad, which I think is really a very important piece, so that it doesn't become, oh, we failed, now we have to do an after action review. I think that failure is a tough word, and I know, Charles, you've heard me talk about this. We know that we learn from failures, but in organizations, when you say, oh, fail fast, fail cheap, that word failure is a barrier to getting the behavior you want, I think, sometimes, because it's a negative connotation. But if you have a process where you say, no matter what happens, we're going to go ahead and evaluate what happened. Was that a smart thing to do? Was it not a smart thing to do? No matter the outcome, I think we'll take the sting out of it. I do think also, just in terms of if I'm a leader and I want to learn from my mistakes or what happened in the past, it's that real honest assessment of what happened, not looking to blame others, but what could I have done differently? Would that have made a different outcome? So I think that's part of it, because, you think about Lincoln. It sounds like, not Lincoln, but Kennedy. The fact that whether he consciously or not said, listen, last time I had this narrow group of folks that I was talking with, I need to expand that, or whether he just learned, sort of subconsciously, I need to get people that are going to challenge me, sort of that devil's advocate. So it was brilliant. The after action review and a post-mortem, where there's a post-mortem, and what's really interesting to do is a pre-mortem, where you say, let's pretend it fails, what had to have failed. So I think that's good. But I do think it's just that idea of, let's look at all aspects of it. And Greg, I'll get you to weigh in, because, again, you've done these very many, many, many times. I find in the corporate environment, people talk about it, it's harder to do, but the military is quite disciplined about saying, again, it seems to me the two keys are, number one, we're going to look at all aspects of it, even if we have a good outcome. And number two, it happens no matter what. It's not contingent on a bad outcome. But Greg, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Relative to formal after action reviews, is that, certainly when you'd have an exercise out in the field, and really kind of came into being at two different training centers that, were used by, all the United States military, National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, and then the Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, the Light Infantry Training Center. And it was a very structured format. The opposing force, basically the enemy, would get up and kind of explain, how they were deployed, where they're at, what their plan was, that kind of thing. And then they'd kind of, let the friendly commander, the unit that was being evaluated, explain what they did. And then there would kind of be a very collegial discussion on, what went well, what went wrong. And what you're really looking for over time is, let's say it was a 2-week exercise and this happened on day 2. What you're really looking for is by day 12, some kind of improvement and change, and, the decisions that were being made, learning from your mistakes, if you will. And it's very tough to, particularly in a corporate environment, to, quote, learn from your mistakes. But I think you can allow some latitude for someone that says, okay, I made a mistake, let's learn from that and let's move forward. Now, if the person keeps making the same mistake over and again, well, then you got to take some other action, but they at least deserve a chance to go ahead and learn from their mistakes. And by doing that, you build I think, a stronger organization, whether it's in the military or in the corporate environment. You build a stronger organization. People aren't afraid for their job. They realize that this is a place that allows you some latitude to learn from that, and you end up growing people, and you end up building trust in the organization and the leadership, of that organization, by allowing them some latitude to learn and make mistakes. Now, obviously, there are some instances where some mistakes are so big you can't allow them that, but I guess maybe that's for a future podcast.
You're right. And that's so critical for the corporate environment to learn that lesson, but it's really difficult to do. I love how Kennedy didn't let failure of the Bay of Pigs define him or at the Berlin Wall. Instead, he adjusted his leadership style, sought contrary views, and implemented a more collaborative decision-making process that really made a big difference with this crisis versus the previous ones. As we wrap up today, Gregg, I'll turn over to you first. What's a call to action to leaders that are listening on what we talked about today, some insights they can glean from this case study in decision-making under crisis?
I think you have to have, I think the thing that really strikes me is how Kennedy kind of Kennedy knew what he wanted to do in most instances, but for two different reasons. Number one, he wanted to test his decision, if you will, and that's why he would go ahead and bounce it off the Joint Chiefs. To go ahead and yes, he was the president, and the military understands that the president's the commander-in-chief, and you do what the commander-in-chief says. But he would go ahead and try to use them as devil's advocates to go ahead and fine tune and increase the likelihood that he came up with a better decision. So I think there's an element that really strikes me about Kennedy's. He pretty much knew what he wanted to do, but he just wanted to test it a little bit. And so I think that was very good, is that he would test it a little bit. And then secondly, there was not a need for him to collect endless reams of information and analyses from different intelligence agencies. Incontrovertible evidence, missiles were in Cuba, something was going to be done about it. It was a question of what we wanted to do along the entire spectrum, if you will, of action. And he did it. So, he really matured greatly in those 2 years, roughly 2 years between the incidents of, between the Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis.
How about you, Kathy? Call to action for leaders based on the topics we discussed today. What do you recommend them starting off with first, if you could mention one thing?
Be clear about your commander's intent. Be very, very clear, and then push that decision-making down. So that's number one. And number two, I think that whole confirmation bias, once again, self-awareness, recognizing that. And so therefore, how do I ensure that I'm getting views that aren't just diverse, but that are in opposition to mine?
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. Really appreciate the conversation. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Yeah, so we have a website. Our company is Enterprise Learning Solutions. It's elslearning.com, and you can get in touch with us through our website. Thanks so much. Thanks, Charles.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.